The wind came softer that morning, like it too was tired of clawing the earth. It tiptoed across the parched garden beds and nudged the door of the worn-down cabin, as if asking permission to enter. Ruth Wynn didn't look up. Her hands were wrist-deep in flour, kneading what little was left from last harvest. She moved without hurry, shaping the dough with slow care, like a woman who knew there'd be no second loaf. There was no one left to feed but herself. And even that felt like ceremony more than need. Her sleeves were rolled high, and the bones in her wrists showed more each year. She'd buried a husband 9 years prior, and the world hadn't handed her a replacement for what it took. No child had followed, though not for lack of prayers. The prayers just dried up, like everything else. That morning, the crust of the land shimmered beneath the sun's early breath. The grass had quit long ago. The chickens hadn't laid in weeks. Still, she woke, dressed, braided her hair, and lit the stove, out of memory, more than hope. She had just finished brushing egg wash across the top of the loaf when she heard the faintest crunch on the gravel road. It wasn't the preacher's cart, nor the widow neighbor's mule. This was a slow, dragging sound, like someone walking without knowing if they ought to be. She opened the cabin door not with urgency, but inevitability. Down the narrow path, just past the stone fence that barely held form, came a figure. Tall, gaunt, hatless, dust on his shoulders like he'd been walking a week and not met a soul. One boot was torn near the toe, and he limped not from injury, but where? A starving man doesn't stride. He stumbles. Ruth didn't wave, didn't reach for the rifle above the mantel. She didn't even speak. She simply stepped aside and let the smell of baking bread carry its own message. The man paused near the porch, eyes sunken, skin like parchment. He didn't ask. She placed a plate on the porch bench, just one slice, a sliver of butter, and a mason jar with half water, half tea. Then she went back inside. He ate slowly, reverently, as if chewing words he hadn't spoken in years. By the time she stepped out again, he was asleep against the porch post, his hat now in his lap, head tilted back, the plate scraped clean and resting neatly beside him. Ruth didn't ask his name. She covered him with the blanket she usually saved for the rocking chair and let him sleep until dusk painted the world bronze. When he stirred, blinking like someone unsure if the dream had ended, she simply said, "There's a pump out back. Barn's empty if you need a place to sleep." He nodded just once, not grateful, not ashamed, just seen. He slept in the hay that night. Ruth watched the stars through the slats in her roof, listened to the fire crackle, and for the first time in a long while, her cabin felt less hollow. The next morning, the woodpile was stacked. She didn't hear him do it. No noise, no boasting, just fresh split logs laid where the dwindled pile had been the day before. She left another slice on the porch. That became their rhythm, silent, circular. He did chores without being asked. She left food without being thanked. He repaired the clothesline, patched the barn door, even fixed the step she always avoided because it squeaked like sorrow. Once, she caught him tracing his fingers over the etched name on her husband's grave. Just a touch, as if paying respect to a man he'd never known. He spoke for the first time on the 5th day. "You don't owe me anything." She looked up from her mending. "Bread's just bread," she said. "It don't ask why it's eaten." He nodded, then looked at his hands, as if he'd just remembered they used to build things. He told her his name the next day. Levi. Nothing more. No origin story. No war tale. Just a name. It settled between them like a fence that didn't need mending. She began setting 2 chairs on the porch in the evening. At first, only she sat. Then he did. Then neither spoke. They watched the land together. The sky seemed less cruel with someone beside you. She learned he once carved wood for a living, had a small business before railroads cut through the towns, and men like him weren't needed. He learned she had a box under her bed filled with letters she'd written but never sent. Some to family, some to God, some to no one in particular. Levi asked once why she'd never remarried. Ruth paused, then said, "Some days I think I buried more than just him." He didn't push further, just looked at the cracked boards beneath their feet. The town whispered. Ms. Adele rode by more often, commenting loudly about propriety and appearances. The preacher stopped by, and I'd Levi like a dog near a henhouse. He asked Ruth if she still wanted to be saved. She answered, "Ain't I already breathing?" The preacher didn't return after that. The old mailman chuckled when he noticed the smoke from her chimney was steady again. "Glad to see the house remembering how to be warm," he said. She didn't reply. But when he left, she smiled. Levi began carving again. Not for sale. For her. First a spoon. Then a small cross for the mantel. Then a porch rail, smooth and curved, with a rose pattern she didn't recognize. She asked what it was. "My mother's garden had wild ones," he said. "She used to press them in books." Ruth traced the design with her fingertips. "You build like you're staying." Levi looked out at the horizon. "Only place I wanted to be quiet in." Ruth didn't answer, but her breath caught in that way it does when a wall leans just enough to let light through. One evening, after the sun bowed low and the stars had begun their nightly whispering, she placed a second plate on the table inside. Not on the porch. Not as a favor. It was an invitation. He hesitated at the doorway, then crossed the threshold like it meant something. Sat across from her, hands clean, shirt patched, face freshly shaven. They didn't toast. Didn't pray. Just ate. She passed him the butter without asking. He poured her tea without speaking. Afterward, he stood by the hearth and stared at the flame like it had an answer. "You ever miss being loved?" he asked. She didn't blink. "Only when I remember I used to be." He nodded, slowly, as if he'd been waiting years to hear it put that way. That night, he didn't return to the barn. She didn't offer the bed. He didn't ask. But she left the fire burning longer. And when she climbed beneath her quilt, she listened to the steady breath of someone sleeping just outside her door. The next morning, the porch frame had a new beam, fresh, solid, carved with the same rose pattern. She touched it, then looked to where he stood near the fence, whittling another piece. "I don't need a porch, Levi." "You need a place to grow old on," he replied. "One that don't creak every time it's remembered." She smiled softly. "And if I ain't growing old?" He shrugged. "Then it'll be a damn pretty place to rest in the meantime." She laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling back to life. That evening, as the sky painted itself in soft firelight and the wind leaned in to listen, Ruth sat on the unfinished porch beside a man who asked for nothing and gave everything in return. She didn't know where he'd come from. Didn't need to. She only knew the chair beside her wasn't empty anymore, and that her second loaf would be ready by morning. The mornings turned gentler, or maybe she simply stopped bracing against them. The frost still came, thin as breath across the window panes, but the cabin felt less hollow now. The air moved differently with two people inside it, less echo, more hush. Ruth had never measured the weight of silence until it shifted. Each day, Levi returned to the porch, sanding, cutting, shaping. She watched through the curtain, pretending to be busy with her embroidery. The railings curved like song verses, deliberate and patient. He never asked where she wanted the swing. He simply built one, tying its ropes with the same kind of care folks use to braid a child's hair. She still didn't ask why he stayed. She just fed him. Sometimes stew. Sometimes biscuits. Once, when he repaired the cracked roof before a storm, she made apple pie from the last of the canned preserves. He ate it in small bites, like it deserved remembering. The porch grew day by day, plank by plank, like a quiet miracle unfolding under their feet. Every nail seemed to say, "I'm not leaving." It wasn't just lumber. It was love in the shape of shelter. She just didn't know how to name it yet. Neighbors noticed. Ms. Adele arrived one bright morning, her bonnet flapping indignantly in the wind. She dismounted with a grunt, glanced at the porch with a sniff, then looked at Ruth like she was a bird keeping company with a wolf. "Heard you've taken to feeding drifters like kinfolk." Ruth didn't look up from her sewing. "He ain't a drifter. He builds." Adele's eyes narrowed. "Folks say he's wanted south of the border. Deserted some cattle war. Maybe worse." Ruth kept her hand steady, even as the thread trembled. "He ain't hiding," she said. "He's right there, hammer in hand. Danger don't always wear a mask, Adele warned. Sometimes it carves roses and sits on your porch. Ruth met her gaze then, soft but steel underneath. And sometimes salvation don't wear a collar, she said. Sometimes it's dusty and quiet and just hungry enough to be real. Adele left after that, grumbling, her boots tapping judgment against the porch Levi built. That night, Ruth found Levi stacking fresh-cut wood. She told him about Adele's visit, about the talk, the accusations. He didn't flinch, just stared into the firelight, as if the flames were whispering things he'd already heard 1,000 times. "You leaving?" she asked. His voice was gravel wrapped in velvet. "I built the step to creek, remember? So you'd always know I was coming back." She nodded, but doubt clung to her shoulders like wet cloth. The next morning, he was gone. Not for good, just gone. No note, no saddlebag left behind. Just absence, cold and full of echoes. The day passed like syrup, slow and too thick to swallow. By sunset, she found herself sitting on the new swing, arms wrapped around her knees, listening for a sound she never thought she'd miss. That creak. When it came, she nearly cried. He returned on horseback, a borrowed mule trailing behind him with lumber lashed tight to its sides. "I needed more cedar," he said, dismounting. She didn't answer, just took the reins and led the mule to the barn like he'd never left. That night they shared stew again, this time by the fire. She told him about her father's porch, how it collapsed the week he died, how no one ever rebuilt it. He listened without interruption, hands folded like prayer. She asked him what happened in the South. He stared at the flames. "I was asked to shoot a man I respected more than the one who gave the order." "And did you?" "No," he said. "So they called it desertion. I called it staying human." She reached out then. Not far. Just enough to let her hand rest atop his. It was enough. 2 weeks passed, and the porch was done. It wasn't fancy, just wide enough for a table, 2 chairs, and a swing that knew how to listen. He didn't ask to stay. She didn't ask him to go. Instead, she placed a second pillow on her bed, tucked it neatly beside her own, and left the door open. But that night, the preacher returned. He came on horseback, dust at his heels, voice louder than necessary. "Ruth," he called, dismounting with a Bible under one arm. "I bring you clarity." She stepped onto the porch. Levi stood just behind her, quiet but steady. The preacher squinted, his voice syrupy with suggestion. "I heard he's still here, still sleeping in your barn, still taking your kindness and offering nothing in return." Levi stepped forward then, not confrontational, just present. "I gave her a place to sit," he said, "a porch with no debts." The preacher sneered. "She needs a husband, not a handyman." Ruth stepped between them. "I need peace," she said. "And peace don't come from someone shouting salvation at my doorstep." The preacher looked at her, really looked, and saw that whatever flicker of obedience he once assumed in her eyes was gone. What remained was clarity carved from loneliness and mended with cedar. He left without another word. That night, Levi sat on the porch swing, silent. She sat beside him, fingers wrapped around a warm mug. He whispered, "I'm not a good man, Ruth." She smiled. "Good men don't usually say that." He turned toward her, the night cradling his features in shadow. "I never meant to stay this long." She looked out at the land, at the fence he'd mended, at the garden he'd helped replant, at the roses carved into the railing. "You stayed just enough," she said. "Long enough to remember how to be home." A storm rolled in 3 days later. Thunder groaned like old regrets, and rain slammed the windows like fists begging to be let in. She stood in the doorway, watching as Levi moved through the rain, securing the shed doors, covering the mule, and checking the roof seams. Soaked through, shirt clinging, hair slicked back, but purposeful. A man who no longer ran from the weather. When he came inside, she handed him a towel and said, "Next time, just call at your house." He froze, then nodded, with the kind of relief that bends a man's knees without taking him down. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But when he touched her shoulder, and she leaned into it, it was more binding than any vow. Spring arrived. Birds returned. The garden greened. and the porch, weathered by rain, warmed by sun, held them both. One afternoon, a traveling man passed by, looking for work. Ruth gave him bread. Levi handed him tools. The man worked a day and left with coin in his pocket. No one mentioned that a year ago, Levi had been that man. By midsummer, folks stopped whispering. A new rumor took hold, that the widow who gave away her bread had found herself a man who knew how to build more than fences. A man who fixed things quietly. On the last day of August, Ruth found a carved box on the swing. Inside it, a ring made of rosewood and a note that read, "I can't promise forever, but I can promise the porch won't rot, and neither will I." She stood there, barefoot on the wood he built, heart full of every empty space he'd quietly filled. He stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands, eyes steady, but unsure. She said nothing, just slipped the ring on, walked over, and rested her head against his chest. They stood there as the wind moved past them, brushing the porch rail, fluttering the curtain inside, whispering, "This is what love looks like when it learns to be quiet." Years later, children would visit that house. Grandchildren, neighbors' sons and daughters, even strays who heard about the porch that creaked just right when someone came home. Ruth's hair turned silver. Levi's hands grew stiff. But the porch never sagged. And when she rocked in her chair, holding his hand, she sometimes whispered, "I gave him bread once." And he'd smile, eyes crinkling. And she let me stay long enough to build her a place worth growing old on.